Welcome to the Cannabis Pioneers Show. I'm here today with one of the greats, Keith Stroup. Keith has been part of the movement to legalize the use of medicinal and recreational marijuana since before most of us were born. He's the founder of, it's true, he's the founder of NORML, which is an important group that helps promote the process of marijuana education and legislation worldwide. Keith, it's a privilege to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
That's very kind of you. I had to laugh when you indicated that I've been at it longer than most of you have been alive, and that's probably true because I'm an old man.
It's 3:00.
Keith, I want to start this interview with asking you, what's the deal with marijuana? Why has public opinion of it been so morphed despite the overwhelming facts to the contrary, specifically when tobacco and alcohol are readily available? What's the history behind marijuana usage and hemp usage as far back as you can share with us, and how did we get to a point where it's basically scheduled as a drug and not federally legal, I should say, yet?
Yes, I think you're right. Yet is the important adjective or adverb there. Well, basically, alcohol and tobacco have been accepted culturally in this country since the beginning of the country, frankly, even earlier. Whereas marijuana was generally unheard of in this country, or very few people were familiar with it, and until the 1900s, actually even the 1920s, 1930s, you began to get some anti-marijuana laws passed by some of the states. And of course, in 1937 is when we first made it illegal under federal law. And the process of doing that was this massive propaganda campaign. It's referred to generally now as the Reefer Madness era. But when marijuana was presented by the new head, Harry Anslinger, of the recently established Bureau of Narcotics, this was back in about 33 or 4, I think the Bureau of Narcotics was established. In order to make his new agency important, Harry Anslinger began a campaign of convincing the public that marijuana was truly a dangerous drug, and not just dangerous in the sense that you could abuse it like any drug you can abuse, but rather that it was something that was foreign and threatening. It was principally, I should say, used at the time by Mexican-American migrants and by black jazz musicians, neither constituency of which had much social standing or political power in our country at that time. And some of the allegations, as hearings were being held all over, they were fairly limited hearings, but there were a couple of hearings in Congress before they passed the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, and they made allegations that otherwise law-abiding citizens, if they smoked a marijuana cigarette, would turn into a violent criminal and would rape and pillage. In particular, it was said to make white women want to have sex with black men. And my goodness, we know we couldn't allow that to happen, at least not in the 1930s. Unfortunately, these absolutely crazy allegations were generally accepted as true in this country at the time because there was almost no familiarity with marijuana. It seemed like a foreign substance that had a Mexican name. Nobody quite knew what it did, so they believed the worst. Now, what has happened over time is marijuana use, basically because of those groups, in particular the black jazz community, marijuana found its way up the Mississippi River to Chicago and over to New York, just like jazz music did. And people such as Mez Mesereau of the jazz era, he was a major dealer and provided to a lot of the jazz musicians at the time. And they, in turn, He handed off the practice of marijuana smoking to the Beat Generation, to Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and those folks. And the reason that's important is because that's where marijuana smoking went from primarily a minority community activity, primarily black, but again, some Hispanic migrant workers as well. All of a sudden, it was introduced to the Beat Generation, and they were primarily white. And from there, it went to the hippie generation, and they were primarily not only white, but white and middle class and suburban. They just like to wear their hair long and dress a little differently. So in that process, the country generally began to learn that marijuana didn't really seem to be such a bad substance. In fact, it seemed to be far less dangerous than alcohol or tobacco. And so you began to have efforts to legalize marijuana. The first one was a group called LEMAR, based in New York, that Allen Ginsberg, the poet, helped form. And for a few years, they had some chapters in 2 or 3 states in the Northeast, but primarily in New York State. That group morphed into a group called Amorphia, which during the early 70s, late 60s, I guess they started in 70 or 71, they tried to legalize marijuana. They were based on the West Coast, and they raised money by selling Acapulco gold rolling papers. It was a kind of interesting concept because it seems like a perfect circle where you raise money selling rolling papers and you use that money to fund a legalization effort so that marijuana becomes legal. The problem with the theory was that rolling papers were also illegal. They were considered paraphernalia. So at some point, Amorphia had to close down their operation, so they merged with Normal and actually became our West Coast affiliate. So it comes full circle. But again, when we started Normal in 1970, Gallup poll had just done their first poll to measure public support for marijuana legalization, and only 12% of the public supported what we were trying to achieve. 88% of the public was against us. So that, you can imagine the extent of the misinformation that was prevalent at the time. On the other hand, after these past 4.5 decades of working on the issue, we have actually reached a position in this country now where more than 60% of the public nationwide oppose prohibition and support full legalization, not just medical use, but full recreational use as well. And it's not because the public has become pro-marijuana, it's because they have become anti-prohibition. And in some recent surveys that have dug a little deeper into the data, what they established were, well, first off, only about 14% of the country are marijuana smokers in the U.S., and that's true whether black or Hispanic or white. Yet we enjoy roughly 60% support. So what that demonstrates is that we are winning this issue because we have finally largely won the hearts and minds of the American public. But again, when people drill down into that data, what they find is it's not pro-pot. They still have generally a negative impression of recreational marijuana smokers. They're about split almost evenly as to whether medical users are good people or not. So it's clear that we still have some work to do. Our goal is to convince the majority of Americans that responsible marijuana smokers are just average citizens who get up and go to work every day. They raise families. They contribute to their communities in a positive manner. And so there's no reason to fear us, or there's no reason to treat us like criminals. But we still have some work to go. So although they now understand and support the concept that you shouldn't arrest marijuana smokers, and it's better to regulate the market than to prohibit it, they still have a general negative impression of those of us who smoke.
Very interesting. I'm very intrigued if you can provide us with some statistics and data with regards to the amount of users. You said 14%. How is that divided between medicinal and recreational? The volume of transactions in the country. I mean, how many people, how many times per day do people use, when you say these regular citizens, average people who just light up something or use it for medicinal purposes? What are the growth rates? How many jobs have been manufactured or and taxes collected? Just if you can portray a picture of how this market is today, and Keith, if you don't mind, share with us the how much is already legalized, how much of the usage is already legalized, and how many have to act like criminals and go to the illegal market and buy it there.
Well, there are two ways that marijuana smokers try to get around prohibition in this country. Now, keep in mind, we have 8 states where adults are legally allowed to use marijuana, and there are recreational dispensaries, places where you can go buy it in a safe and secure environment. But that still leaves, 42 states that haven't. Now, there are 30 states that have legalized medical use. So, in fact, in the majority of the country now, there is some version of medical marijuana available. But again, that still leaves about 20 states out there that haven't yet accepted it. Some of those have legalized high CBD ointments, but most of those, you can't have more than 0.03 THC in it, and you can't use it in a smokable form. There's still a lot of sort of bias and prejudice in those laws, reflecting the attitudes of a lot of state legislators. What they're saying in those medical states where they want to help seriously ill patients find relief, so they're allowing high CBD marijuana to be used, but not smoked in most cases. But they don't allow THC. Now think about that. THC is the primary constituent of marijuana that causes the high. And the high is just another word for saying it makes you feel good. Well, for most of us, if someone's seriously ill, making them feel good as well as dealing with the medical symptoms is a positive thing. But for most of these state legislators, they still see something wrong with getting high. So that's why the versions of medical marijuana that have been adopted in the more recent years have been more watered down. The earlier medical laws, like the one in California, you can essentially get anybody can qualify as a medical patient and get marijuana. But in most of the states, it's not so easy. You really have to have a serious condition or disease to do it. So again, one way people get around prohibition today is they act like they're sick. If they're in a state that has a fairly lenient medical marijuana law, they get a doctor who's sympathetic who writes them a recommendation, and so they can get their marijuana and enjoy getting high without any risk of being arrested. The problem with that tactic or that strategy, and I don't blame people who do that, because obviously the goal here is to get people out of harm's way, but it suggests that you have to be sick to smoke marijuana, when in fact what NORMAL has always been about, the acronym itself, you can imagine, we came up with that. We believe there's absolutely nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana, and it should be of no interest or concern to the government. We don't want the government coming into our houses to know what books we read or what music we listen to or how we conduct ourselves in the privacy of our bedroom, and neither should they be involved in whether we drink alcohol or smoke marijuana when we relax in the evening. It's just simply none of their business. But for large amounts of the large numbers of marijuana smokers, and there are roughly 30 million regular users in this country. I think it depends how you define regular use, but I think monthly use, it's more like 20 million. Annual use, it's 34 million, I think. But those are significant numbers of people, and the majority of them still live in states where it's illegal. So they still take risks. They still have to buy their marijuana from a black market. They still have to hide their marijuana and be careful that the neighbors don't know they smoke for fear that somebody's going to call the police and turn them in. We still have over 600,000 arrests a year in this country, marijuana arrests, and 90% of those are for an ounce or less. In other words, they're simply marijuana smokers. They're not growers. They're not dealers, as they used to call people who sell marijuana. They're just people like you and me who, when they relax in the evening, enjoy smoking a joint. And frankly, I should acknowledge up front that I'm actually bi-druggal. When I get home in the evening, I roll a joint and pour a glass of wine. I like both drugs. But given a choice, if I have to make a choice, I assure you I would choose marijuana. I think the high is much more pleasant, and it's also far less damaging to your body. In terms of the market in this country today, it's still largely underground. But we do now have, once California adopted full legalization, which they did last November, along with Maine and Nevada and Massachusetts, California is such a big state that it took us from something like 5 or 6% of the American public living under full legalization, that once that law is implemented in mid-2018, we'll be up to roughly 22% of the population of the country will live in a full legalization system. So we're making a lot of progress, and we've made more progress in the last 5 or 6 years than we made in the first 40 of this effort. But that's not a surprise. It's not because we've come up with new arguments. It's because we have gradually picked up the support of the average American. And obviously, when you can show 60% or higher support for a position, it begins to be easier to get voter initiatives passed. And we're even getting close now to passing full legalization by way of a state legislature. All of our victories so far have been by way of voter initiatives. But unfortunately, only 26 states have the option of voter initiative to change public policy. The other 24 states do not. So we have to be able to win this issue among our state elected legislatures, and we're very close. We passed a bill this year in Vermont that the governor vetoed, but they're reconsidering it in an extra session right now, so that may happen. And we've got several states, especially in New England, where we're close to winning by way of the legislature. But again, I don't want to suggest that this battle is over. I think we've got a lot of work to do before we end the practice of treating marijuana smokers as criminals all across the country. We're making great progress on the West Coast and on the East Coast. We're making some progress in the Midwest, but almost none in the South yet.
At least one thing that's good about this process is that they're reviewing anything and everything so scrutinized that when they do legalize, there will be no gray areas. Everything will be monitored, regulated the way that they want, because I see that this takes forever and goes through so many committees and bureaucracy that once it's legalized, it won't backfire or anything like that. That's at least the bright side of all these challenges that you're facing.
Well, that's a point we might discuss for a moment. There are a lot of supporters of legalization who prefer a system where there would be no regulations at all. In other words, an individual would simply be allowed to grow as much marijuana as he wanted, to possess as much, to sell to somebody without a license. It would just be a free market. But that's not honestly realistic. And if we held out for those kinds of systems, we would continue prohibition for God only knows how long, at least another decade in this country. But by accepting some reasonable controls, age control is the basic one, in all of the, even the medical use states, they have age limits, and there are provisions in several of those where if the parent concedes or agrees to it, then you can get a doctor to prescribe it for a child for Dravet syndrome or seizures or for a few conditions. But for recreational marijuana, it's always limited to those either 18 and above or 21 and above. What the science suggests is that's probably a good thing. It's probably better if we can discourage alcohol use and tobacco use and marijuana smoking when people are young because their brains are still developing, and there's some suggestion that it's simply not healthy for kids at that age to be using any sort of drugs. But we also know that roughly 50% of the high school graduates in this country, and this has been true for at least 20 years, have experimented with marijuana by the time they graduate high school. And yet there's no evidence that those people have been injured. In fact, most of them go on to college, they get good jobs, they get married, raise families. There's no suggestion that just because you experiment with marijuana when you're younger, that somehow, you're going to destroy your life. Quite the contrary. I think for many of us, the use of marijuana has enhanced our life. For a lot of us, I'm 73 years old, so I don't have to worry about a developing brain, right? But for a lot of us, marijuana smoking is personally a creative experience. When I'm preparing to do some writing, for example, I like to lock myself in my office and turn my computer on, get stoned, and write down everything that comes into my mind. Now, I obviously don't do anything with it right then. I sleep, get some sleep, get up the next morning and take a look at it. And sometimes I laugh at myself because I put down a couple of things which I really must have been stoned, because it doesn't make much sense when I'm straight the next morning. But overwhelmingly what I find is that I saw some insights, or I had some insights, that I should have had without getting stoned, but I didn't have. I think our traditional educational system, our traditional way of thinking, in some ways inhibits us. It keeps us from being as creative as we might otherwise be. Marijuana smoking sort of loosens that up and allows one to think outside the box, I think the expression is. So it's not just that marijuana smoking isn't a really bad thing. I think in the right situation, it's actually quite a positive experience that can enhance an adult's life.
And Keith, okay, what I'm asking you is, going forward, what do you think, the next 3-4 years would look like? Because now we have proof. You've got states that are legalized. You can see the jobs manufactured there, the jobs created. I'm sorry, the taxes that are being collected, the wage growth, the some suggestions say that the police work is becoming more efficient, and that the youth is getting more and more educated about this and have far less harmful experiences with either with other drugs as well. What can we expect from other states? How quick will this become from now on?
The U.S., the individual states have always been considered experimental grounds. It's a place where you can try new policy ideas and see if they succeed or fail. And after a period of time, and after several states have tried different approaches, you've got some data that you can work with, and that's really the stage we're in right now. Every of the 8 states that have fully legalized marijuana in this country right now, each of the 8 states is somewhat different. Some of them are significantly different, but that's a good thing. We really do want to see what works best and see if we can develop a consensus. One of the benefits of the Obama administration, from our perspective, is once we began to pass legalization laws, we naturally had to fear that the feds might come in and seek an injunction in federal court and shut that system down, or they might even bring in federal police and try to arrest the people who had licenses to commercially cultivate or sell marijuana. There's all kinds of possibilities, none of which were very, very promising. But what Obama did, which was the most significant contribution I think we could have possibly had from a president, he asked his Justice Department to stand back, and they issued a series of memoranda called the Cole Memoranda that basically said, so long as the states were careful to pay attention to 6 or 7 areas, but they were the ones you would expect. For example, they wanted to make sure that they were taking steps to discourage adolescent marijuana smoking, even though it was going to be legalized. They wanted to make sure they were taking steps to avoid the marijuana being shipped over state lines from a state where it's legal to a state where it's illegal. They wanted to make sure they weren't importing marijuana from out of the country or exporting it. But as long as they were willing to follow some of those common sense rules, what the Obama Department of Justice said, if you follow those rules carefully, we will not interfere from the federal level. And the point you mentioned, what that allowed us to do, it's allowed us to have 4 and 5 years now of experience. Instead of having a debate in which one side says if you legalize marijuana, the sky will fall, and our side says if you legalize marijuana, it'll improve the country. Those are all, they're theoretical. There's no facts there. Now we have facts. We have Washington and Colorado in particular that have been up and running long enough. We have a lot of data. We know, for example, in Colorado, they, I think, created over 120,000 jobs. I think in the first 4 legalization states, they created over 250,000 jobs. Colorado, by the way, now has the lowest unemployment rate in the country. It's only about half of what the unemployment rate is in most states. And that's attributed primarily to this growth of the legal marijuana industry. They've also raised hundreds of millions of dollars in taxation. When California goes online next year, it is estimated the market will be $6 billion a year just in the state of California, and the tax it will raise for the state will exceed $1 billion a year. That's not million, that's billion. So you can imagine what an impact legalization is, a positive impact that legalization is having. So now when our opponents come and claim the sky's going to fall if you legalize marijuana, we can point to real data. We have governors, for example, in Oregon and Washington and Alaska and Colorado, none of whom favored legalization when those initiatives were on the ballot. We had to win those without the support of most state elected officials, but they're now totally on our side. And in fact, they're taking steps to guard against Trump trying to shut down their industries. So I really do think the single most important thing that happened in the legalization movement in this country is we had that period, 4 or 5 years there, where we were allowed to demonstrate the effectiveness of legalization without the feds interfering. And as I say, there are a couple of different ways you look at this. Obviously, the economic benefits to a state are important. Most of our states have a tight budget, and a new supply of revenue is important to them. But on the other hand, so long as they were still thinking that marijuana was a terrible substance and that it would cause terrible repercussions to society if we legalized it, it was sort of like gambling. There were years in the United States where the only place you could gamble legally was Nevada, and then later Atlantic City, New Jersey. All the other states knew that there was a lot of money to be made from legalizing gambling, but they kind of considered it immoral. You know, there were the tenor was set by the church groups and by the moralists. And so as long as elected officials felt that their constituents thought marijuana was an immoral substance and smoking was immoral, no matter how much money you might make, they're not going to legalize it. It's like suggesting you legalize prostitution, which is obviously legalized in a couple of counties in Nevada, but that's it in this country. So the economic argument works now, or it's beginning to work, but it only works because public attitudes have changed. They no longer see it as a threat to society or as a threat to our culture. And more, in fact, I think they're seeing the positive benefits. And of course, the bottom line is we have been wasting and misdirecting enormous amounts of criminal justice resources in this country, chasing and arresting and prosecuting marijuana smokers that should have been focused on fighting violent and serious crime. And in those states that have legalized, they now have that option. And the police are more and more coming on our side. So I think that for the next several years, what you're going to see in this country, we'll continue with a state-based strategy, principally because so long as we have a Trump in office, some of us hope that won't be too long, but as long as he's in office, and Jeff Sessions, a racist anti-marijuana zealot that he is, there's no way we're going to make any significant progress on the federal level. But I think in the next 5 years, we'll legalize marijuana in at least another 8 states, probably more. And we are gradually beginning to build enough support in Congress that I can imagine in 4 or 5 years, we might be able to remove federal laws so that the states don't have to worry about a hostile president stepping in and interfering with their system, which is what we now have to put up with. But again, that's 3, 4, 5 years away at a minimum. So we'll continue basically a state-based strategy.
And Keith, with regards to what you're saying about police work, what usually happens if the police finds somebody smoking? Does he get arrested, and then what?
Well, yes, in states that have not decriminalized. Now, by the way, we have, I think now, 19 or 20 states that have taken kind of a middle step. That is, they've said possession of an ounce or less of marijuana, all of them are a little different, but roughly it's an ounce, will no longer be treated as a crime. You're not arrested in some of those. There's no penalty at all. In others, there may be a $100 civil fine. But where they have the fine, it's implemented by way of a ticket, like a parking ticket, where you mail the money in. You don't get a criminal record, and you don't have to go to court. Now, excuse me, in those states, if you have more than that ounce, and in the other 30 states, well, not 30 because 8 of them now have legalized, but the other 20 or so, no, you are still arrested. You are indeed taken to jail. You are often held for at least a day or so before bond is set. Sometimes, if you only have an ounce of marijuana or so, you may only have a few $100s bond. But if you happen to be caught with 2 or 3 ounces of marijuana, instead of recognizing that just as alcohol drinkers often like 3 or 4 kinds of whiskey or 3 or 4 kinds of beer, marijuana smokers also like different strains. So the fact that you may have 3 or 4 ounces of marijuana doesn't mean you're in the business. It means you're a consumer who enjoys trying different strains. But I can tell you that if they come into your house and catch you with 3 or 4 ounces of marijuana in one of the states that has not yet decriminalized or legalized, you will be charged with possession with the intent to sell, or perhaps even sale. And those are felonies. You can look at 5 or 10 years in jail still for possession of just 3 or 4 ounces of marijuana. So we, as I say, especially in our southern states in this country, but also to some degree in the Midwest, we still have a lot of work to do to get them to understand that just because someone may sell a couple of ounces of marijuana doesn't mean they should be treated like a violent criminal. They're not forcing marijuana on anyone. They're simply making marijuana available to those of us who like it, the consumers. And otherwise, the only way we can get it is to grow our own. And cultivation in most states is considered a serious felony. I live in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., and I wouldn't think of growing a plant at my house. I have a backyard that's fenced in. I'd love to do it. I'm an old farm boy. I was raised on a family farm. But cultivation in the state of Virginia, even if it's 1 or 2 plants, it's a felony, and you're going to serve jail time. So, of course, I don't grow it. So that means I don't have any choice but to buy my marijuana on the black market. Obviously, that's not a great situation, and over the long haul, I trust that we will change the law here in Virginia as well. We have a very active group of normal activists in Virginia, and I think we're getting close to adopting medical marijuana here. We're probably 5 years away from recreational marijuana, but it's still a serious offense if you're caught. So we have to live in a surreptitious manner. We can't be open about our marijuana smoking, or you will find yourself in trouble. Also, let me mention this. For marijuana smokers in this country today, even if you're in a state where marijuana has been fully legalized, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and now the other 4 states, you can still be fired from your job simply because you test positive for marijuana without the slightest indication that you came to work in an impaired condition. And as I think you probably know, when you smoke marijuana, the THC stays in your system for a few days. If you're a regular smoker, it'll stay in your system for a few weeks after you last smoked. it doesn't mean you're impaired. You're only impaired for about 60 to 90 minutes after you smoke. And for those who are listening that are smokers, don't drive right after you smoke. That's one of the dangers that scares non-smokers, is they're concerned that you're going to have a lot of stoned drivers out there, and it's only going to make the problem with drunk driving even worse. So let's be sensitive to those concerns and not drive while we're stoned. But on the other hand, just as with employment discrimination, nobody has a right to go to work in an impaired condition. And if they do, I have no trouble with the fact that an employer can fire them. But they should have to show impairment on the job, not that you may have smoked marijuana last weekend when you were, relaxing at the lake with your family or whatever. The same thing with child custody. We have people calling normal almost every week who are having to fight the child welfare agency in their state to retain custody of their children simply because a nosy neighbor smelled marijuana and called the child welfare agency and reported them. And when they do that, the agency comes out to the house. They do a home inspection. There's this presumption that if you smoke marijuana, you probably live in a filthy house, I suppose. And then secondly, you have to take a parenting course. You have to take a drug education course. And you have to promise that you will never smoke in front of your minor children. Now, I don't have any problem with not smoking or drinking in front of your minor children, but there's no requirement in this country that you can't drink beer or smoke cigarettes in front of minor children. So it's sort of stupid to put that on to marijuana smokers. But most importantly, they should have to show that you are an unfit parent before they take custody of your young children, not simply that you smoke marijuana. So again, in employment rights, child custody rights, and DUID, we still have to go back, even in the states where we've legalized it, and fix those aspects. There are efforts underway to do that right now. But our goal is to get to where, in a state that has legalized marijuana, a responsible marijuana smoker should be treated fairly in all aspects of their life, period.
Keith, I want to switch over to the investment side. With normal, and just FYI, how long have you been smoking marijuana?
I first smoked marijuana in 1965 when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School, and I've been a regular smoker ever since. So I guess that's 35, 52, 53 years. That's right. I am indeed. It's strange how the time flies when you're having fun.
It just goes to show you that, you're 73, you're with us for almost 30 minutes, and we're having a blast. And I hope that the country becomes much more liberalized and open to marijuana usage, both medicinal and recreational. I want to move over to the investment side. You get to speak with private entrepreneurs that are launching startup companies. You probably get around to speak with entrepreneurs who have IPO'd, and the companies are on the public, on the stock markets. How early are we with regards to the investment front?
Well, right now, there are some investor groups that I think without question are quite legitimate. In other words, people who form venture capital groups and they raise millions of dollars, and they sort of announce their availability to fund projects if you can convince them that the project is one that has a good chance of succeeding. And so a lot of the startup cannabis companies go to those groups, those venture capital groups, for their funding so they can expand. They certainly can't go to a bank and indicate the business they're in and expect to get a loan. They can't even in this country. Most people in the business can't even have bank accounts and can't accept credit cards because of some federal banking problems that we're also working on. But there's no doubt that there are lots of people attempting to get rich off of what we call the green rush. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, we live in a free market society, and in most fields, the goal is to be successful financially. Not entirely, that's not the only goal, but that's generally what people in business, their primary focus is. They got to show a profit, they want to make money, etc. And unfortunately, when you have a new industry like this, you have a lot of scam artists. You have a lot of scammers that get involved. So not everybody who you meet in the new industry is on the up and up. And I think in particular, there are a number of penny stocks out there that are mostly pump and dump operations. And, I would recommend to potential investors, don't be looking at penny stocks. If marijuana-related stocks eventually find their way on the more serious financial markets, then I would think it'd be a great investment opportunity, because I think there are going to be some tremendous companies. It'll be like the high-tech industry. You're going to see it expanding for many, many years. But I think it's too early to get involved in most of the new companies other than venture capital groups. I certainly, as I say, I would stay away from the penny stocks, both because penny stocks are always dangerous, not just in marijuana, but in this field in particular, I don't think there's any of them that are even close to turning a profit yet. They're just, as I say, the majority of them are what we sometimes call pump and dump.
Interesting. What is next on DC's agenda? What's going on in the federal level?
Well, the big efforts right now in D.C., I think there are over 15 bills currently pending in Congress, by the way, and they do everything from, some of them call for full legalization on the federal level, some of them call for precluding the expenditure of federal money to interfere with state-based medical programs or recreational programs. But none of those have ever been given a hearing. After all, our Congress, both houses now, is controlled by Republicans and fairly conservative Republicans, and we have a hostile president and attorney general. So I don't think for the next 2 or 3 years we're going to get a hearing on any of those bills or a vote. It's still valuable to get them introduced because there's an educational process, and because we're also we're talking both at the state level and the federal level. So there are a lot of states where those proposals are being seriously considered, even if not in Congress. But the one area where I think you will see some progress, even with the current Congress, is what we refer to as the 280E issue. Under our Internal Revenue Code, businesses that are involved in conduct which remains illegal under federal law are denied the ability to write off as a business expense most of the expenses that ordinary businesses are allowed to write off. So what it means is that a marijuana dispensary in Colorado or a commercial cultivation center in Colorado ends up paying something like 85% tax rate. And frankly, that's not sustainable. I mean, if you have a good, solid base of investors, you might be able to put up with that for a few years. But eventually, you're going to go out of business. You can't charge enough for your product to make a profit if you're paying a tax rate at that level. So even though many people in Congress are hostile to the idea of marijuana legalization, they're also business people, many of them, and they are beginning to understand the unfairness of that. And also, for example, part of the federal law is banking regulations is why somebody in the marijuana business generally cannot have a bank account. Well, can you imagine having a business that maybe their gross sales are $1 million a year or something? Some of them are far more than that. And they have to deal only in cash? I mean, that's not only absurd, it's dangerous. They have to have Brinks trucks come by every evening and pick up their money and come back the next morning and bring it back. And there are robberies. It encourages people to underreport their income. There are all kinds of problems with dealing with a cash economy. Yet under our current federal banking regulations, that in fact is what most state legal marijuana businesses are having to do. So I do expect that. Yeah, it's crazy. And again, it really reflects the bias that a lot of older members of Congress and the people who make the rules still feel about marijuana, that somehow it's just not legitimate. And they're not even sure we ever should have allowed it to happen, but we sure as hell are not going to let them use banks.
The fact is that DC has legalized marijuana, so...
That's right. Now, by the way, that's an interesting story, too, if you've got a second. D.C. actually has some pretty good law. First off, we have legal medical use. It was passed by voter initiative, and the Congress refused to allow it to be implemented for a number of years, but it finally was allowed to be implemented. And we even have dispensaries. I think we have 5 or 6 medical marijuana dispensaries in the District of Columbia. So these members of Congress actually drive by dispensaries on their way to work every day. So even though they act like the sky's going to fall if you legalize marijuana, they know damn well that's not true because it hasn't changed anything in D.C. Now, well, that's true. Now, on the recreational side, it's especially interesting. Again, by voter initiative, we legalized recreational use of marijuana, and the city council wants to establish dispensaries because obviously if you legalize marijuana, but everybody has to buy it on the black market, you're really feeding a system that we're trying to get out of. The black market is what we want to change. We want to bring things above ground where it's transparent with regulation. Well, the city council is ready to establish a licensing regime for those who want to commercially cultivate and sell marijuana in the district, and the Congress won't let them. They put a rider on our appropriations bill. And remember, the district is not a state. We are subject to oversight by Congress that no state has. And so for the moment, we cannot, our city council is not allowed to establish dispensaries for recreational use. And as they say, what that means is you, in essence, encourage greater use by eliminating all criminal penalties. And in fact, you can possess up to 2.5 ounces in D.C. You can give up to an ounce away to another adult for no remuneration, but you can give it away, and you can grow up to 6 plants in your apartment. But if you want to get marijuana, unless you're willing to grow your own, you have to go to the black market. So that'll change, but it is an interesting environment for members of Congress to experience.
Yeah, my partner just came back from a large marijuana convention, and it was held in D.C. So probably one of the largest in the country, if I'm not mistaken. Can you speak to us?
I was just going to say it was actually held just outside of D.C. at what's it called, National Center or something like that. But I know it was a very big show.
Sure. Keith, what is NORML?
NORML is a marijuana smokers lobby. We started it in 1970. As a result of some work I had done with Ralph Nader, consumer advocate Ralph Nader, as part of my efforts to avoid the Vietnam War. I fully admit that I was a draft dodger and was doing my best to avoid that war. When I graduated law school in 1968, it was at the height of the Vietnam War and the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement in this country. And as a result, my generation in large numbers were radicalized politically by that experience. We were trying to do anything we could to avoid being drafted and sent to Vietnam because lots of people were coming back in pine boxes. I think we lost something like 65,000 Americans during that war. And frankly, none of us could quite understand why the hell we were there, what the fight was about. And I think now, with a little benefit of hindsight, most Americans would agree that was a misguided war altogether. At any event, I was very close to being drafted. I was, I think, just 2 weeks away from my induction date when my draft board gave me what was called a critical skills deferment. Now, admittedly, I had the help of some lefty lawyers and National Lawyers Guild lawyers that were helping draft debaters at the time. And they had identified a provision of the draft law that I didn't even know existed, which said if the work you're doing is important to the health, safety, and welfare of the nation, then you can apply to your draft board for this critical skills deferment so that you spend the 2 years you would have been in Vietnam, you spend it at your important job here domestically. Well, I had been hired right out of law school by a presidential commission. It was called the National Commission on Product Safety. And it was a result of the work that consumer advocate Ralph Nader had done. It was principally The legislation was sponsored and moved by then Senator Warren Magnuson from Washington State. Well, during that time, I had 2 years to learn about public interest law. I had actually never heard of public interest law. And what it was, and what Ralph Nader was doing at the time, was you use your legal skills in your law degree to try to impact public policy instead of trying to get rich or instead of trying to help individual clients, or in the case of criminal defense lawyers, which I have done a little of, trying to help individual clients stay out of jail. Public interest law was exhilarating to learn about it. So by the time the commission was over, it was a 2-year commission, I was too old to be drafted at that point, and I had an opportunity to do what I wanted without worrying about being sent to Vietnam. And I thought, man, I really like this idea of public interest law, but product safety wasn't a driving issue that I cared that much about. But marijuana smoking was, and marijuana legalization. So I simply decided, let's put together a nonprofit organization and let's get to work and see if we can't legalize marijuana. So and by the way, because of my work with Ralph Nader, who was a consumer advocate, from the very first, we designed NORML as an organization to speak for responsible marijuana smokers, not the industry. I have nothing wrong with the industry. I mean, the fact, if you didn't have people growing and selling marijuana, we wouldn't have anything to smoke. So I don't mean to suggest that they don't have their own interest in this as well, but they've got lots of money. And so there's a strong lobby to take care of the interests of the industry. But what we wanted to do was to make sure that consumers had a seat at the table. So for the last 47 years, I guess now, we have done our best to try to represent the interest of responsible marijuana smokers and to make sure that when public policy was being developed, that we had a seat at the table.
Perfect. And obviously on the screen, you've got the NORML website if you want to reach out to Keith. Keith, in closing, which states are next?
Well, I think Arizona will come back and try again. They came relatively close last time, so they'll try again. Vermont is close. Rhode Island is close. Connecticut is close. Michigan is close. In fact, hopefully it's going to be on the ballot by a voter initiative in Michigan next year. Pardon? Who's not close? Well, Mississippi, Alabama, Oklahoma, South Carolina. In most of those states, by the way, there is some activity. They're at least beginning to consider the medical use of marijuana or decriminalizing minor offenses. But when you talk about full legalization, I think the last few states in America will include Oklahoma, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi.
Understood. Keith, it was a pleasure having you on, and you're a world of information, and you've dedicated your life to this. What more can we say? This has been an amazing interview, and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting me.